Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And as always, on every Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, we have a star studded show for you. We cover all the stuff the BBC just won't and doesn't. We also cover independence, we cover just a raft of other subjects as well. And tonight is no exception. For example, tonight we'll be talking about boxing, we'll be talking about genocide, we'll be talking about the front page, we'll be talking about South Africa. And that's just a small taster to convince you to stay with us for the next 60 minutes, almost. I just want to make a small comment, if I may, about reform. It would seem that today in Parliament, Reform and one of their MPs was getting excited about the burqa. This lady stood up in Parliament and demanded that the Prime Minister ban the burqa. She's terribly upset and concerned that people are whatever. Why? I've absolutely no idea. But one assumes that she's appealing to a fairly base community. I guess next week it'll be the kilt. Who knows? She doesn't look to me like somebody who would ever wear a kilt. Interesting situation we have at Westminster just now. We have the strangest bunch of folks there representing the great British public, that a more sort of eclectic bunch. I think more eclectic than I've ever seen before, frankly. And that's saying something, because they're all a bit sort of slightly spaced out. Some people would argue you have to be that way in order to be a politician, a professional politician. I don't know. If we could persuade more professional politicians to come on the show, they could perhaps rectify that misconception, if it is one. So, without any further ado, let me introduce our guest tonight. David Patrick has been with us before, and it's always a pleasure to welcome him. And we're going to be talking about some of the things that I mentioned earlier. Welcome, David. How are you?
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on.
It's a great pleasure. And how are you this evening?
I'm very well. You know, it's a wee bit cold outside, but it wouldn't be the Scottish summer without the weather keeping you guessing. So, but I'm doing very well. Looking forward to the show tonight.
Good. It's interesting because I travel a little bit and go in different countries. Scotland is one of the few places I've asked people how they are. They talk about the weather.
It's just, I think it's the easiest thing because it's always on your mind. And if it's
terrible, I know.
You know, 500 days of the year, and those rare times when it's nice, you know, it's even more noteworthy.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. So, I said we were going to talk about a bunch of things tonight. Let's start with boxing.
Okay.
Tell me about your book on boxing.
Well, the last book that I published was a book called A Boxing Legacy, and it was a partly biographical and partly a collection of the edited works of a gentleman called Ted Carroll, who worked for, if there's any boxing fans in the audience tonight, especially anybody who's watched professional boxing live, where it's been hosted by Saudi Arabia recently, they might have noticed the Ring magazine being sort of plastered everywhere on the mat, on the ring ropes. It's publicized everywhere. And that magazine was founded in 1922, and for several years was the definitive journal on boxing. It was the most authoritative voice on boxing. And part of the reason why we looked at this gentleman, Ted Carroll, is for all the evidence that we can gather so far, he was probably the only black journalist who ever worked there. And his writings on boxing are particularly interesting. But what also gives his own sports writing a unique flavour is that he also deals with issues of race in America at that time, going all the way from the 1930s to the 1970s. So as a sports journalist and cartoonist, he's a really interesting character. But as a social commentator on America at a time where, you know, racial dynamics were in flux, he's someone that not very many people have looked at so far. So it it was a privilege and an honour to be able to bring his story to life, because he's largely, even within boxing circles, largely unknown.
Right. And when you, what was it that motivated you to write the book?
Well, I would like to give like a very noble answer and say it was because of like, a deep academic desire. But where this actually came from was my old boss and colleague that I wrote that book with, and I'm currently writing my fourth book with, Professor Ian Finister. When I stayed over in South Africa, he was the head of our department, and over more than one occasion, I would pop round to his house and have, not going into the details, but a dram or two were involved. And what we ended up doing was kind of sitting out in his patio talking about boxing, and his knowledge of this subject is impressively encyclopedic. You can name anyone, and he can rhyme off, the record and their height, their reach, and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
And I just sort of like pestered them and said, rather than this just being a hobby of yours, we should write on this, because boxing's a far more interesting and socially relevant subject than I think a lot of people realise. And after several months of pestering, we got around to producing that book about Ted Carroll. And it was a really rewarding experience. But now what we're moving on to, which ideally is a even more relevant book in terms of how important boxing is, is when I mentioned that the Ring magazine was founded in 1922. The person that founded that and was the editor and publisher of it for 50 years was a gentleman called Nat Fleischer. And in that time, in his lifetime, it's no exaggeration to say that he was probably the most respected voice in all of boxing. But regardless of how central he was to boxing for the better part of half a century, apart from his own biographical content that he's released, no one's ever written a book about him. So that's what we're in the process of working on at the moment. And it's for someone who's spent all their career working on media analysis, it's actually quite a cool thing shifting towards biographical analysis, because it becomes more of like being a detective in a way, and you have to like go to different archives and find little strings that you can pull on to try and piece someone's life together. But with this gentleman we're talking about, Nat Fleischer, he met, as a young journalist, he met Mussolini. He was the first editor to report on the Titanic going down. He was met every heavyweight champion from Jack Johnson onwards. He was like personal contacts, if not friends with, and it's been a really enriching subject to get into, but at the same time quite overwhelming, because sometimes you can take on a subject and think, right, this can be done in 6 months, a year, and then you start opening up the archives and you realise there's so much to go through. So that's what I'm currently in the process of doing, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because I remember reading a biography of a guy that wrote the first book on Alexander Hamilton, and he also thought, here's a guy that needs some coverage that he's not getting, because all the coverage he was getting was sort of bland, it was sort of neutered. He was this great man we all owe a debt to, and he was involved in the American Revolution, and he has some Scottish connections. That was it, pretty much. We never knew that he had this penchant for the ladies that led him into so much trouble.
Well, that's a dynamic that affects several men in history. I've noticed that when you go back, certainly several boxing champions were inclined that way as well. But it's also not in terms, because some people can look at boxing and think it's just big lads hitting each other, but it's always had a social relevance beyond that, particularly when in the past, for example, when non-white boxers were the world champion at the time, this released no end of racial anxieties in both America and the British Empire of the time. And the reason it's got a relevance now is part of this larger Saudi project to bring eyes to the Saudi Arabian kingdom. In terms of, they've done it with like football, etc. They've managed to get the World Cup. Saudi Arabia has been putting on the biggest major boxing events for a few years now, because money's essentially no object, so they can bring these super fights together. And I think it was about 10 months ago, this same group from Saudi Arabia purchased the Ring magazine, which had been in the sort of doldrums for several decades. I think they're using this as a way to sort of legitimize their place in boxing now, and hopefully. So, but actually, I don't really think that many people when they see the Ring magazine up on the screen, don't realize how rich a history it has behind it and why it had that unique position within boxing culture.
Somebody has suggested to us that professional boxing is controlled by gangsters. What's your answer to that?
I always think, because ultimately it's not, it isn't and never really has been a sport in the same way that tennis or football or rugby or basketball, name any of them, it is essentially, it's prize fighting. It's just a more regulated version of what it was in the 19th and 18th centuries and stuff like that. And the aspect of, is it run by gangsters? It's always been run by shady individuals. There's always been corruption in it, especially because there's so many different boxing federations. So, everybody wants their slice of the pie in that regard. But it's one of the interesting things that's came up in the research that I've done on Ted Carroll and Nat Fleischer is going down, is that you're talking the 1920s, early 1930s, the height of the Prohibition era. It was almost unbelievable to think that boxing couldn't have been tainted by that. And one of the interesting things that, and I really need to give my colleague Ian the credit for this one, because he's handling this side of the project. We have found one or two instances where, at the time of writing, Nat Fleischer, editor of the Ring magazine, would say a fight was completely legitimate. There was nothing wrong with it, and he couldn't see anything. But then maybe 20 years later, 25 years later, he would admit that everybody in the business knew that it was the fix was in. So it's that influence, that sort of overlap between crime and boxing has always been there. Unfortunately, I don't think it will ever be completely shaken. But now, because of the wild money that's involved, that may be a bit more ring fenced.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat ironic because you could argue that there's a lot of corruption in politics as well. I mean, what stream of society is free from corruption? I mean, wherever you look, there's an element of at least bad faith, if not outright corruption. But it's part of human nature, I guess. And also, I guess you're dealing with fairly disadvantaged people. I'm thinking here about emergent boxers who fall under the sway of people whose backgrounds they might not fully understand, but happen to be of enormous help to them in getting on the first few steps, the first few rungs towards developing a career in boxing. And nobody does it out of the goodness of their heart. So there has to be some payback.
Well, and as you mentioned, as they tend to be, and this has been the case through various stages in history, is that, as you've just mentioned, boxers do tend to come from marginalised or disenfranchised groups. So in the United States, earlier in the 20th century, that's why earlier in the 20th century, there were far more Italian and Jewish and Eastern European boxers in America, whereas by the 1950s, 1960s, the majority are either white or predominantly black in that regard, which again shows that link between like social marginalisation and links into boxing. And you mentioned it yourself a second ago, is ultimately there are very, very few instances of someone getting into boxing when they have come from a wealthy or even comfortable background. Because if you had other options, why would you embark on a career where you're getting punched in the face constantly and you could literally die? So it's a similar thing that we've seen, and we've seen that you've seen a similar thing in the UK as well. Is that you go back, to the sort of like 1900s to 1950, 1960s period, the majority of boxers in this country came from places like Wales or London or Liverpool. Actually, not as many from Scotland as you would imagine, but everywhere they came from tend to be economically disadvantaged. And then in the sort of post-1950s period, we've seen that same thing where, again, a disproportionate number of British professional boxers come from ethnic minorities. So that, again, shows you that same link between lack of social opportunity and roots into boxing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let's move on to changing subjects here now. genocide.
Yes.
What is your take about what's happening just now, and how did you first become interested in writing about genocide?
Well, just sort of remind me to come back to that first point, John, and I'll address what's going on at the moment. My own background, where this came from, is I did my undergraduate degree at Glasgow Caledonian. I had a really great time there, a lot of really good friends, and sort of I like to think that my sort of academic credentials were built there, and any sort of skills I had in that regard. So I've got a lot of fond memories of the place. But the way that I actually got into this was almost entirely by accident, because we had an older lecturer who, by that time, I'm not naming him at the moment because of the context, but he was coming to the end of his career. And as much as he was still a great lecturer, when it came to things like choosing essay questions, he just couldn't be bothered anymore. So it came up to a time where we'd to submit some work. We had complete free reign over what we were going to write. And completely by coincidence, the evening before this, I happened to watch Hotel Rwanda on DVD. And I was kind of shocked that this had happened when I was like 9-10 years old. I had no idea about it, and especially like how horrific and how catastrophic the scale of it was. So I started reading about it, and then ultimately did my undergraduate dissertation on it, my master's, and then that developed into the PhD research, which ultimately underlined this book that's on screen at the moment. And the main thing which Reporting Genocide looked to do was two things. Was one, this has changed slightly in the last couple of years for obvious reasons, but one of the established narratives within the Western world, excuse me, was that the greater knowledge of the Holocaust, greater awareness of what happened during the Holocaust, could somehow act as a means of stopping or slowing down subsequent genocidal events. So the idea was that if people were sensitized through to mass violence through the Holocaust,
Yeah,
they would respond to subsequent acts of genocide. And simply, there's not very much evidence for that historically as the case. And what I tried to point out, excuse me,
okay.
One of the things that I had to point out was that when we get to 1993 could legitimately be considered the high point of Holocaust awareness in the West, because in the United States, it was the official opening of the Holocaust Memorial Museums, a major thing there. But the much bigger factor is that was the release of Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg in 1993. Yes. Few films in history which have had anywhere near that level, not just of publicity for genocide, but also nowhere close to the level of public endorsement, which it received. Various leaders, presidents, TV hosts said, go and see this. And it was a major cultural event when Schindler's List came out. So if this idea fits, that a rise in Holocaust awareness should lead to a greater sensitivity and reaction to subsequent acts of genocide, 1993 was the high point for that. And one would assume that subsequent acts would have been responded to. But instead, what you see is quite the opposite. As in from 92 to 1995, there was consistent focus on the atrocities that were happening in Bosnia, but it was only at certain times. And then the more glaring example is that, barely half a year after Schindler's List had swept the Oscars, the Rwandan genocide took place. And you're talking in this, for people who aren't as familiar with it, roughly 800,000 people were killed in only 100 days. So it's one of the swiftest and most ferocious acts of mass violence in history. But what I found in my research and detailed in the book was that despite all the claims to the contrary, that the post-Cold War world had a commitment to human rights and stopping genocidal abuses, the coverage of Rwanda shows that is just simply not the case. And there were numerous instances where, despite the genocide claiming 100,000 lives and then 200,000, etc., it was always buried within the middle pages of the newspapers. Yeah. So taking all of that together shows that as much as there might be a lot of publicity claiming that when I say we, I mean the Western world cares about genocide. Actually looking at the media response to it and often the public response to it flies in the face of that. That's where my own background comes into this and what my own research looked at to relate that to what's going on and what's been going on in Gaza is a very, very tricky thing to be discussing, because from a legal, I think from a moral and ethical standpoint, it has to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. I don't really see how anyone can see what's going on and not be utterly horrified by it. But in terms of the scale and the ferocity of it, and the fact now that where it's easily 90% plus civilian casualties, but in terms of legally describing it as genocide, there are two, because of the way that the Genocide Convention is worded. It's not deliberately obtuse, but it's so ambiguous that if you wanted to make the claim that that is definitely genocide happening in Gaza, I think there's more than enough evidence to make that claim. But from another standpoint, if you wanted to definitively say no, that doesn't legally fit the standard of genocide, any lawyer worth their salt would be able to do that.
Yeah.
In that regard. So so I think it's one of these things that is going to keep rumbling on. We're going to keep witnessing it. You might get these half-hearted notions that people, or half-hearted claims that politicians are horrified by it, but ultimately it's going to keep going on until Israel decide to stop doing it.
It's interesting in a way because, thinking back to the Holocaust, I think it was Arnett who said she didn't discern sadism. She didn't identify heinous behavior based on particular perspectives that I suspect you and I and everyone in the audience tonight would be able to connect to. You say these are fascists, etc., etc. We could see that, and it's easy to do that. But she talked about the banality of evil. Mm-hmm. In other words, a culture is inculcated in people that tells them that this is not important. This is just, I was struck by that definition because it seemed to me to be a contradiction. How can you talk about the banality of evil? And it seems to me when I look at Rwanda and what's happened since then, that's been borne out time and time again. It's hard to connect to something which is banal. You look for a monster. You know what I mean?
I think that's what Aaron, when Aaron made that, that's what people were so shocked by, because obviously she was using that largely to refer to the actions and sort of personality of Adolf Eichmann, and it was to counteract this idea that in 1945, when the camps were first liberated, a lot of the British and American press did describe the Nazis as beasts, as monsters, as inhuman, as psychopaths. And it's an easier thing to imagine that someone who is capable and intrinsically involved in genocide would have to be abnormal, would have to be some kind of monster or demon. But ultimately what Eichmann showed is that like a lot of people who are involved in this, especially at the bureaucratic administrative level, are just normal people. And I think in that a lot of ways, by showing that, Aaron actually showed that, like, I think that was a more unsettling thing for people, because it's much more it's easier to write off the Nazi regime as like an abomination of history.
Yeah.
If you convince yourself that everyone included was psychologically abnormal. But if you say that no, most of these people were just office workers and clerks and train drivers. Yeah, people like you and me, and that's where that
was shocking. That was shocking, and I thought, surely she doesn't mean that. But then when you read it in more depth, she's very clear. She said, "You're looking for monsters. There are no monsters. If you want to find monsters, look in the mirror." It's shocking. It really is how anybody can be reduced to that level of barbarity, but not in somebody coming along and saying, "I'm going to twist your arm and I'm going to make you feel pain, and this will render you into this monster." Not a bit of it. You just walk up to the person and say, "I need you to kill 1,000 people by the end of next week." Okay.
And ultimately, it's happened at various times. One major difference that I've noticed, though, in terms of responses to genocide or responses to mass violence that we've seen with the example of the Israeli onslaught in Gaza is that there's far more public outcry to this than there ever was for genocidal violence in the 1990s. There was never, you only have to look at some of the protests that have happened in cities up and down the country, but especially in London. We are talking, there's been, pro-Palestinian, stop the onslaught marches that are reaching hundreds of thousands of people. So it's not like this is necessarily a societal sickness where no one cares about genocide. But when we look at the establishment media and established political individuals, they've already made up their mind on this, because you can see it. The clearest indicator you can see it is because of the way that the BBC is covering this at the moment. Is the BBC, whilst they will highlight the human cost of this, there is always, and when people start reading it closely, you start to notice these patterns. And the BBC is always at pains to stress that there is some kind of equivalence between this violence. So it's the case that, the death toll now might have reached 52,000 or 55,000 or 60,000, but they always have to link it back to what happened on October 7th. At this point, we're talking that the sort of Israeli to Palestinian deaths in this is a ratio of probably 1 to 50. At this stage, completely out of proportion. And another way that's interesting that I've noticed completely from the start of this conflict is that the BBC do their very best to shut down debate on this issue, because there's a function, it's called Have Your Say on the BBC. It's essentially their comment function. And it's only ever selectively applied. You can't do this on every single story. But usually if it's, something that doesn't matter, the latest football signing or something like that, you can comment on it. Also very common to be able to comment on the Russia-Ukraine war, because the general consensus is anti-Russian, so that's allowed on there. A lot of anti-American stuff, and there's even a lot of anti-Labour stuff on there. But one story which never, ever has the comment function is the conflict in Gaza. And part of that, I think, is because they know that largely public opinion isn't really in line with official establishment opinion, so they don't want to highlight that. And that's another reason that these kind of things keep happening. But
I think there's a wider significance too. If people fail to see what they regard as being a major issue, which they need to ventilate and discuss, not being covered by the media, it corrodes the role of the media. In other words, people no longer have the same degree of confidence that it reflects the way they feel about things. And I think once you go down that route, it's very easy for people to talk about fake news, etc., etc. Now, I'm not suggesting that the BBC is like the arrangements in the United States. It's not, with Fox, etc. But nonetheless, it could easily happen that way, where people completely lose confidence in the ability of the media to cover major topics. Because once you fail in one area, that failure, it just spreads right across the whole output. You can't contain it. If you lose integrity, if you lose that ability to be in touch with people, then it's very harmful, it seems to me. Now, we might not see
one of the things though
just yet.
Well, one of the things though that the BBC is always sort of by definition going to be constrained by is official British policy. Official British policy, to give like a sort of contrasting example, is that Russia is a designated enemy and Israel is a designated ally. And we've got two countries which at the moment are both guilty of human rights abuses, but it's only human rights abuses conducted by Russia that get the mainstream coverage in this regard. Whereas when it happens from an Israeli perspective, it tends to either be ignored or it gets minimized in some way. And that's where, usually where that's coming from is it's an extension of British official policy.
Yeah.
In that regard, I'll just notice on the question, should I address this? Has social media helped highlight Gaza? In that regard, yeah, I think it has. I think like human rights, war crime type abuses, it has been easier to publicize these things because of social media. one of the issues that Gaza has had is actually several issues with, especially in the early months, was a sort of internet blockade, if you want to call it that. So, like Wi-Fi signals and infrastructure for getting those kind of things out from the ground were very difficult. But it does allow for footage and coverage of various atrocities to get out in a way that might not have been the case even maybe 10, 15 years ago in a similar situation. How I think, to answer that question, how I do think social media has helped Gaza as much as it can isn't necessarily the recording of atrocities. I think it's more social media has allowed interested groups to come together more. So in the past, whereas people might have been actively trying to protest these kind of things, they might not have been able to get that groundswell of opinion the same way, because it was harder to connect with people. Whereas now with social media and like hashtags and stuff like that, it is easier to highlight these things. But again, one of the most insidious aspects of this is it has been shown that major companies, including Facebook, have been actively filtering that type of material so that anything that was too damaging against Israel was actually being put to the bottom of most people's feeds. So we
covered Facebook and its role in Trump's first election. And if you've read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you can't get a hold of it, we covered it last week, and it's about a woman from New Zealand who spent some time on Facebook, and she was shocked at the degree of influence that Facebook had over people's voting intentions in the first Trump election. It was
social media in general, I think, can be very damaging in that regard, because even probably infinitely more so than the mainstream establishment media ever were, because I've mentioned this to several people, is even go back, maybe it's not that far, like just maybe a decade, 15 years. Before that, even though what you were getting from the newspapers and from the TV media might well have still been propaganda, which it largely was, and it was telling you a certain set of values and certain political norms that you were supposed to stick to. But at that time, it was a one-size-fits-all thing, whereas it was one story, and it might have all been lies, but it was all aimed at the same people, and it was everybody read the same story. Whereas now, with things like social media and AI, everybody's political content is actually tailored exactly to them. So you can have 100 people in a room all looking at their phone, and they might all be getting the same story, but they're all getting a different version of it that's going to appeal
You're
to
absolutely
them.
right. The way it worked for Trump was, let's assume that you and I are neighbours, and you were for abortion. For the sake of discussion, you're for abortion, I'm opposed to it. You would get a message from Trump directed to you on your feed that says, if you vote Trump, you will support the right for abortion. At the same time, I would get a message directly from Trump that said, vote for Trump because he's completely opposed to abortion. And we're neighbours. And that's the big difference. And that was done by design. And what they also did was that they detuned messages from the Democrats. In other words, they moved data away from you and I, if I can follow the metaphor through, that you and I were prevented from getting information that we would have gotten normally, because the Trump team were embedded in Facebook, not the other way around. And that suggests a degree of control over what you and I are exposed to that's never happened before.
It's never happened before, and I think the thing that's even more terrifying is the fact that we're now going to this sort of like post-reality age where like AI can generate so much content and material in such a short period of time that you can give the impression that almost anything is happening. So you've got this bizarre thing now where on Facebook you can go on to, like a political discussion website, and if you go to the comments, about half the comments are like AI bots talking to each other. It's not even people interacting anymore. But you've got AI bots that are trained to be like left wing or right wing, and then they argue with each other, and it generates like views. It's such a strange thing. So you could have two AIs arguing over an AI generated story, and there's no humans involved in it, but people will still get angry about it.
It is really crazy. I mean, I came across it entirely by accident. I was doing some correspondence with people in different countries, and And one response came back, and before I could type anything, the program said to me, "Would you like to say the following to this person?" And it actually typed on the screen, appeared a response, a reply. And I'm thinking, hold on a second here. This is nuts. This is absolutely crazy. I did not engineer this. I did not ask for it. I have no idea how it happened. I can only assume that the person who I was interacting with was using AI. I don't know for sure. But here I was, completely exposed to AI without any conscious effort on my part. Absolutely crazy.
Oh, it's going to become unavoidable soon.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, it is scary. And we're talking about the banality of evil. Maybe we need to include in that the banality of AI. Crazy stuff. Yeah, and now you wrote a book on media coverage and who writes the news and authorship and gender in the 2014 referendum. Tell us a little bit about that, David.
The first who writes the news, that was an article I wrote back in 2020, and it was about as much as very, very statistical heavy, so I'm not going to sit and bore the listeners with any of this, but I'll just give a sort of broad brushstrokes as to what the main findings were. The reason I even started looking at this was I went through a long period where I had to sit, and this is as boring as it sounded when I was doing it, was going through, I think it was the better part of 7,000 articles to do with the referendum that were published in Scotland, and just cataloguing them. So, who wrote these, who put these down, and blah. And one of the things after a month, 2 months of doing this, it just dawned on me that very few of the names that I was cataloguing were female. Okay, and then so this sort of took me down a little road. And when I looked into it, I noticed there's quite a big discrepancy in terms of wider political journalism in this country, but especially as it related to the referendum. So when you think that roughly half the population are female, and the roughly half the population are female, and I actually know that this is in 2014 at least, more than 50% of registered journalists in the NUJ were female. So one would make the assumption that if you look at the proportions of who was writing the news during the referendum and comment pieces about it, if not exactly 50-50, you would hope it's somewhere in that regard. But what actually came out is across the board, it's mostly in terms of news article production, comment article production, it's closer to about 75% written by men. And in some instances, when we look at things like comment pieces, in some instances it can be 80-90%. So what you actually find is across the board is that very, very few female voices were ever given a platform to cover this, and even when they were, they tended to be minimised. And I think that's probably quite a major thing to take note of. As perhaps we go forward, perhaps there becomes another independence debate. At the very least, is despite women making up 50% of the population, their voices were largely marginalised in the mainstream press during the 2014. And I would hope certainly if moving forward that would be something that's changed, but. Even though I haven't had the time to look over the statistics, I really don't think political journalism has changed that much, and it seems to be very much the realm or an exclusive realm, mostly of male commentators. And I think that's probably got to have an impact on the style of political language, the nature of political debate, and probably also might dissuade certain people, certainly women, from having an early interest in politics in that regard if they never see themselves represented in these forums. So it's certainly something that I think is a major aspect of the debate that's been overlooked so far, is that women, despite being half the population, were nowhere near that proportion of coverage.
Yeah. I mean, it always struck me that, Scottish journalism in general, but perhaps political coverage in particular, it was always a bit of an old boys club. It was guys who got together in the pub with a couple of PR people from the political parties, and they concocted a story that the editor would be supportive of. That was struck me as the relationship. Or alternatively, late at night when they were desperate for a story, they knew they could phone somebody in one of the political parties and get an exclusive of some kind, all tarted up to fill some pages the following morning. But do you think that newspapers generally have a future?
I'm not entirely. People have been discussing the death of the newspaper industry for as long as I've been at university. I've heard it was coming for the last 20 years, and as much as it has been in constant decline, it's nowhere near dead yet, because it's still, even if the idea of like print newspapers are going a bit out of fashion, seems almost antiquated.
Yeah.
The online versions of these newspapers will keep going on, because ultimately, even if few people read them as much as they used to, they still, particular right-wing newspapers, they still have a function in terms of being an outlet of the party that they support. So whilst fewer and fewer people read the likes of the Daily Mail or the Express or the Telegraph or the Times, the fact that they still trumpet what the Tory party wants them to gives them a relevance and will keep them alive for longer. So I really don't, as much as people seem to think that the mainstream media has an imminent death approach, and I actually don't think I think it will cling on to for longer than people realise, because there's so many overlaps with established power.
I know, but I wonder too if how sustainable the business model is. It seems to me it's increasingly predicated upon advertising rather than sales on the ground, as it were. And that's not, it doesn't strike me as, a strategy that I would want to pin all my hopes to. I mean, if I'm not persuading people to buy the product at the newsagents or to consume it online, and I depend increasingly on advertising, advertisers are fickle. If advertisers find out, for example, that they can sign up to your TikTok feed and get 1,000 times the coverage they get from the Daily Mail, they're not going to place ads in the Daily Mail. They're just not, because you will offer them a deal which the Daily Mail just cannot meet. And if while the market may appear to be terribly fragmented, i.e., you cover baked beans for Heinz, and somebody else will cover I don't know, soup for bachelors, that might be sufficient to the purpose. Because right now, if I place an ad for baked beans in the Daily Mail, a whole bunch of people are not going to be, they're not interested in baked beans. They're just not. So I miss that whole community.
There is an aspect, and I completely agree with the points you're raising, especially about the general print media sector and news media sector being in decline. But another aspect where I think it might hold on is it still remains one of the most insidious and unavoidable forms of propaganda. Because granted, everybody's social media feeds and on your phone and stuff, you can't avoid these things. But one thing you really can't avoid is if you're walking around in general society, if you walk through a train station or a shop or down the street, is you're often without realizing this, exposed to the front page of numerous things. And you only have to think of like the examples from during the 2014 referendum, is how many front pages were plastered with huge headlines, essentially independence bad, right? Or some variation of negative coverage of the independence debate. Even if you didn't buy a paper, even if you never buy a paper, you take that messaging in, because if it's you see those headlines, and if the only headline you see is this person is bad, this political party is bad, if you see it day after day, month after month, even without buying a paper, you have this this passive influence that it has on you. And I think the newspapers are aware of that. So I don't think that they would be in a rush to get rid of that influence.
Yeah.
And there's also the aspect that even though the sales are down, certain newspapers particularly within the metro, like the London Metropole, still have a prestige to them. So aspects like the Financial Times or the Daily Telegraph, they might not sell anywhere near the numbers that they used to in terms of daily copies, but they still have this prestige and they're still listened to.
I wonder if there's also an element where there's a receptivity amongst people in Scotland that maybe doesn't exist elsewhere. On my travels, people will often say to me, "Oh, that's the such and such." Yeah, that's not a material I consume. They're very clear about these things. It's said openly. It's not done discreetly. They say straight in your face, "That's not for me. I wouldn't read any of that." And also thinking back to the American Revolution. I mean, most of the channels were controlled by the British government, and yet almost nobody believed the stuff that they were printing. And even though the actual so-called patriots who won were producing sort of flimsies that didn't have the same quality, they had credibility because the audience sought that credibility.
True.
I wonder if the Scottish audience is in a position to do that. I mean, I find there's a lot of people in Scotland who are very observant of and give credibility to sources that, frankly, people elsewhere would dismiss. I mean, they wouldn't repeat the material. It just wouldn't happen. It wouldn't feature in their lives at all. But yeah, in Scotland, for example, if I have a feed on Twitter or Blue Sky, somebody will send me a headline from some Mail or Record or whatever, and I think, why are you doing this? I'm not interested in this sort of stuff. And I thought it was obvious that I wasn't interested, but they still place credence on that source.
A lot of people
do that. You're actually aiding and abetting the very thing that you deplore.
Ironically, in that regard, yeah, and it's one of those. But I think part of it also comes from like a general culture thing. I really can't blame, as much as I've devoted my career to deconstructing this and looking into it, I really can't blame anyone in society for being convinced by propaganda messages or being taken in by this, because for one, you're never told anything different. But certainly when you're younger, you're never, like at school, out of all the various things we're taught, one of the you're not taught to be critical of the media. Especially things like the BBC. As we grow up, it's anti. It's one of those things that's always there, and it's just taken as like a news source that you can rely on. But ultimately, it's the state British broadcaster, and it's going to have an agenda. It's not going to be as balanced and impartial as it likes to try and promote. But most people don't realise that, because it's it's like anything else. It's like a part of the furniture, and that applies. So people, I can't really. Whilst it can infuriate me at times that people can be taken in by certain political messaging, by no means could I ever blame anybody for it, because you're never told.
I do to a degree. I think there's a susceptibility there which doesn't exist in other cultures. But we've only got 10 minutes left, really. A couple of minutes left in some respects, 12 in total. Not just because of where you're actually located, but give us your thoughts on the by-election, David.
Right, well, obviously the by-election you're talking about, for anybody that hasn't been following it, is the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election, and I'm a proud son of Stonehouse myself, so this is one of the only times in my life that this region has in any way been politically relevant. Like normally, even when they're counting the results, like in the actual election nights, they don't even bother with here because no one cares. But just to show you, this isn't son. That's literally what I got through the door yesterday. So I think there's 8 different parties there in that regard. So they're really trying their best to get the seat from various angles. I couldn't by any means speculate as to which way it's going to go. If it was to go anyway by the degree of campaigning, it would be the Labour Party, because Labour are pushing this hard in this region, and every person I know has had them at the doors. But one of the things that gets me when you read through this kind of material, and you can understand from this why people get so fed up and disenchanted with politics, is very little of any of that material is anything positive, anything hopeful. It is just blame someone else, negativity. And every one of those things, it doesn't matter what colour it is, doesn't matter which candidate it is on, it basically says, this group have failed, we will do better. So whether that's most of the parties blaming the SNP at a national level, or the flip side is the SNP blaming Labour at a council level, But when you actually look at any of these, very few of these have got anything specific to do with this area. So that's one of the reasons it's been interesting to see. I never thought I would see Nigel Farage in Larkhall High Street, in a butcher's. But I realised he was up visiting yesterday. I'm not convinced that we're going to see anything like this swing to reform that we saw in the English local elections. They might get an electoral bump, but I really don't think it's going to be this sort of tidal wave that hit England. I think it's if anything, it's going to be down to, I assume, Labour or the SNP at the moment, and it could be very close. It depends what the turnout is, but in terms of actual campaigning, I think it's a sorry reflection of democracy in this country. There hasn't been one town hall meeting. There hasn't been any sort of debate between the candidates whatsoever on no sort of format, no town halls, radio discussions, nothing like that. And when you actually look at the campaigns, none of the campaigns are in any way focused on this local area whatsoever. So it's interesting to be a very, very short-lived focus of political intrigue. But
would it surprise you to learn that the opinion polls are saying it's a straight face-off between SNP and Reform, with Labour nowhere?
I'm not convinced of that. I'd be not convinced of that. I really don't think Reform can be doing anywhere near as well as to be taking on the SNP. It would have to be an enormous change. But ultimately, I could well be wrong in that regard. That but I really don't. If the opinion polls are saying that Reform are actually challenging for this seat, that's certainly not how I would think it's going to go. I mean, that's pure speculation on my part. I really don't know. I could be proven wrong tomorrow.
I think, regardless of what the eventual result is, I expect that Reform, the media will deem Reform to be the winners.
Chances are that's what they tend to do.
That's what they want to say.
What's more likely to happen is you're probably going to see a drop in both, because the SNP have been in a national government for several years. As tends to happen is when a government's been in for several years, they do tend to see a drop in support. So you'll probably see a drop in the vote for the SNP, but also the fact that even though it's for an MSP position, because Labour are the UK government and they've been in long enough now and made enough mistakes that people are starting to sort of back against them or push back against them, they'll probably see a drop in support. But I don't think that that's necessarily all going to be replaced by Reform, which I think even people who would do that as like a protest vote or the like. But in any case, I think that from a local boy's perspective, I'd be surprised if a lot of people around here, especially in Stonehouse, even bothered to go out and vote, because having someone who's lived there his entire life, I don't want to focus the whole thing just on Stonehouse because it involves Larkhall and Hamilton as well. But the lack of investment in this region in general over that time is scandalous. And when you look at it, this village had infinitely better transport links, employment opportunities and whatnot 30 years ago, even 100 years ago, than it has now. So it might make me sound rather cynical, but regardless of what literature's coming through the door, I don't actually think any of them, whoever it is, are going to make any change.
Do you think people are increasingly cynical about politics?
Oh, I think so, and I can't blame them for it whatsoever, because most people, like, especially if you're a Scottish independence supporter, it'd be very, very easy to be sort of like clinically depressed for the last 11 years, because it's just everything you vote for seems to be like removed, and you add in aspects of, was it 63, 64% of Scotland voted to stay in Europe, but because the rest of the UK voted, we get taken out. So when this happens, election after election, referendum after a referendum, you start feeling like your vote doesn't matter. And because of that, people do become disenchanted. And then even on the side of where you get what you vote for, most people wouldn't be happy. Like, I doubt most of the people who actually voted for Brexit and supported Brexit were voting for the version of Brexit which we were ultimately handed at the end that we had to settle for. And that applies to a lot of things. And, Labour came in on a sort of wave of hope a wave of hope and optimism, after several years of Tory cuts and very, very negative campaigning. And any goodwill that they've had since they got voted in has really quickly evaporated because they've had so many missteps. They seem to be very out of touch with the public. And the fact that a party, to give one example, that claims to be socialist in its values, is one of the first things they do is remove the winter fuel payment. Yeah. Like for older people, is like that. It stands in stark contrast to what they supposedly they vote for. And now you speak to a lot of people, and I cannot blame them for thinking this, is ultimately there isn't a great difference, especially at the UK level. There is no great difference between the Tory party and the Labour Party beyond the colour of their ties.
Yeah, I mean, Labour supporters say to me, I want to see, particularly reflecting over the plans for increasing defence expenditure. They say, look, I'm Labour because I believe in welfare, not warfare. And that's what I want to see. And then inevitably, Jeremy Corbyn's name comes up and they say, well, that's what I want. I want somebody who steps up to the plate and says, we're not spending money on bombs, we're going to spend money on kids and disadvantaged people and pensioners and winter fuel. That's what I thought I was voting for when I voted for change. That's what they say. And what I've got is the very opposite. I've got a guy who appears on the screens and tells me we need to build more weapons of mass destruction, etc. That's not what I voted for. That's not the change I voted for, they say.
100%. I think a lot of people feel exactly the same way. So because of that, when you were asking, are people disenchanted with voting, the whole electoral system? I think hugely, and it would take massive reform to actually bring that back. And when I say that, I don't mean as a pun that it would take the Reform Party. I mean reform of the system. Yeah. So I don't want to be misquoted on that. It would take big changes for this to ever. I wouldn't want to be misquoted and folk think I was encouraging voting for Farage, because no.
Look, David, thank you very much for tonight. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Are there any last points you would like to cover that we haven't already discussed?
No, as happened the first time, John, it's a testament to your ability to keep the show going, as it were, with no breaks and the fact that I didn't realise we were anywhere near up to an hour. So I don't know if that also says that I maybe talk far too much, but I've really enjoyed it and I really appreciate you having me on.
No, it's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure because, we try and bring people, well, the themes that we have. It's about information, education and entertainment. And that's what we try and do. And what I don't understand, frankly, is why the main broadcasters can't do what we're doing. To me, it's straightforward, it's simple, it's not expensive. And yet, the few occasions I watch mainstream broadcasting, it never fails to make me feel that there's a huge waste of money here.
No, 100%.
It's a colossal waste of money and almost no help to the viewer whatsoever. Mainly because there's no interaction, which I think is the key to communication. When I look at mainstream broadcasting, what strikes me is it's good at information, but terrible at communication.
Well, that's a very insightful way of putting it. And you only have to look at something like when you talk about the money and the lack of insight into it, is a prime example of this is Question Time on the BBC. Is you can have a panel of 5 or 6 people, each one of them talks, but no one actually says anything.
Yeah.
At the end of it, but it sort of looks the part, but ultimately, it means very little. And ultimately, I think in a functioning democracy, I think the public deserve far better than what we've been given so far. But on that regard, on that note, thank goodness we've got people like yourself, mate.
Well, that brings me neatly on to the crowdfunder. So, folks, as I say every time, please support the crowdfunder. If you like what Indie Live is doing, the best way to show your appreciation is to support the crowdfunder. As you can see, we're well away from our final target. So whatever you can do, just give us that support. We greatly appreciate it. A big thank you to you, David. And can I say to everyone watching and listening tonight, take care, stay safe, and look after each other. Good night.